Welcome into the Musketeer Report podcast. It's been a while. Great to see everybody here in the YouTube chat today. If you have questions, you can leave them for us and we'll get to them. Paul Fritschner alongside Rick Broering. Xavier right now heading into the last week of the regular season, 15-14 overall on the year, 9-9 in Big East play with 2 games remaining. Xavier was on a 4-game losing streak, but then snapped it with back-to-back wins over DePaul, 91-58 final score. That was at Cintas. And then Georgetown over the weekend on Saturday, a 98-93 comeback win for the Musketeers, 61 points in the second half for Xavier. In that win, Claude goes for a career-high 36. Xavier right now sitting at 51st on KenPom, 61st in the net. They're not on the radar of any bracketology reports. I wouldn't say they're completely dead yet, but they are completely dead yet. I guess technically, if you want to get into the nuts and bolts of it, if Xavier goes 2-0 this week and you pick up 2 quad 1 wins and then you get 2 quad 1 wins in the Big East tournament, you end up with 4, maybe you have some life. But that's just to set the table for everything that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of this show. Rick, it's good to catch up with you. Like I said, it's been a couple of weeks since we've done a show. So let's start off talking about what we think was more impressive over the last couple of games. We've seen Quincy Olivari and what he did in the second half against DePaul. He put up 28 points in the second half against the Blue Demons. Claude was too short of that in the second half against Georgetown, put up 26. Olivari finished with 32. That was after he scored 43 against DePaul in the first game. So 75 combined points against DePaul in 2 games this season. Claude had 36. He was 13-20 from the field. He only took 1 3 in that game against Georgetown. He missed it, but was extremely efficient, got to the rim, was able to score pretty much with ease whenever he wanted. 4 rebounds, 4 assists, only 2 turnovers. Their stat lines in those games, Quincy and Des, were almost identical. Quincy had 1 more rebound. Otherwise, the stat line's basically the same. I think looking at how the game played out and what Des has been through over the last few games with some shooting struggles and everything else, I'm going to give the edge to Des there, just willing the team back to a win in what was a desperate situation with Xavier losing in that game. But to score 75 combined points in 2 games against the same opponent, that's incredible, because generally when you see somebody score that many in the first game, the team's going to make some adjustments and it's not going to happen in the second game. I know it's DePaul, the worst power conference team literally of the KenPom era, but still, to be able to go out there and do that again a second time, it's not for nothing. So, Rick, that was 3 minutes of my setup for this podcast. Take it away.
Catch your breath, Paulie. Catch your breath.
Yeah, go ahead.
This question is a good one, because you're sitting there watching these games back to back, and they're 2 meaningless games for all intents and purposes, right? I mean, the DePaul game is totally meaningless. The Georgetown game for Xavier, I mean, it could have been a bad loss. So I guess from that standpoint, at least you're able to avoid an embarrassing loss here at the end of the year. And it was good to see some of the young guys step up and all of that. But we got 2 really memorable individual performances here from Quincy Olivari and Desmond Claude. I mean, these are games that I feel like we will talk about 7-8 years from now, when these different games come up where we're like, oh, what was the loudest Cintas Center has ever been? And we'll be referencing like a Georgetown game from one of Chris Mack's years that was a meaningless game, right? Different things like that will pop up from time to time when we have these conversations on podcasts. And I think both of these performances by Quincy Olivari and Desmond Claude will be those types of performances where they come back out in Xavier lore throughout the next several years, maybe even decades. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about these 2. And I guess I agree with you that ultimately, because of the situation of the game, that Xavier was behind, they needed a miracle, needed someone to step up and take over at the end. Otherwise, they were going to suffer an embarrassing loss at Georgetown. And Desmond was able to give them that in the second half, and he was totally dominant. Like I wrote in the takeaways article, this felt very much, and I'm the oldest of 3 boys in my family, so this felt very much like when my younger brother, who is a more talented basketball player than me, would be talking to me, talking about how he's better than me all day, and then we would go out, play one-on-one, and I just bury his ass in the post 10 times in a row, score every time, or have him hack me and check it up again. That's like what Desmond Claude was doing to this Georgetown team in the second half of the game. I mean, it was just drive a guy to the rim, physically overpower him, even if they cut him off, he would pivot back the other way, spin back, whatever, multiple efforts to get to the rim. He just would not be denied. He'd either get fouled or he scored. Now, Quincy Olivari's was way more aesthetically pleasing. His performance with the deep threes, the one shot where he's in the lane, he kind of like threw it up over his head as he was getting fouled and it went in. I mean, he had some great shots, but it's just hard. Like when you're blowing out DePaul the way they were, and it's all kind of meaningless and feels like the game's carefree at that point. It just, I don't know, for some reason it doesn't feel as significant. But I mean, in terms of like most impressive, it does get hard because like we're talking semantics there. And again, Quincy Olivari probably made the more impressive shots if we're going that way with the question.
Yeah, you look back at what Quincy was able to do in that game in the second half and putting up almost 30 points. But just the threes, it's so refreshing watching a game like this. And I think I've said this before here on the show, where he shoots a three and you just know it's going in, right? Like in those two games against DePaul, it didn't matter where he was on the floor. And he's had some off games this year. He didn't play well against Georgetown, but it didn't matter because Des was fantastic. But for the vast majority of this season, Quincy Olivari takes a three, and there's a pretty good chance that ball is going in. And that's just such an easy feeling to have as somebody watching the game, where you're just thinking, oh, okay, get him the ball and make a play.
Yeah, I mean, to put up that many points on that few of shots is just absurd. And he was 6 of 10 from 3, which is really impressive. And you're right, Paul. It felt like in the second half there, every time he put up a 3, regardless of how deep he was or how good the defense was that was being played, that ball was going in. And in the game against Georgetown, it kind of felt the same way in the second half. Whenever Claude got the ball and started driving towards the basket, it's like, oh, he's scoring. I mean, they're not going to stop. I don't know how they didn't decide to like run 2 guys at him and make him give up the ball and make someone else beat them or something, but they didn't choose to do that, and he just kept taking it to them. Both of those were 2 of the more dominant individual performances that I've ever seen since I've been covering the team.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, they're up there with that first half Blewett had against Cincinnati in the shootout when he scored 40. I mean, it's kind of similar vibes to that, the way it's just like they're so unconscious and so dominant. You'll remember it for a long time.
To talk more about what Des did against Georgetown, I saw somebody bring this up on the thread. It might have been you in the recap. But the way that Des was able to attack Georgetown and specifically the players that he was going after, it seemed like it was the first time in a while that he was comfortable just, off the dribble, getting right to the rim, playing the style that he likes to play, being physical, just getting to the cup. It wasn't the forced mid-range, I have to take 2 or 3 threes here to maybe open some drives up. It was, I'm just going to go at you, and you're not going to be able to stop me.
Yeah, and I think this is part of where we have to get into the opponent that you're playing, right? I mean, there's a reason Georgetown and DePaul haven't won many conference games this year, and in DePaul's case, any, and in Georgetown's case, they've only beaten DePaul, and it's because of things like this, right? Every other team has had a pretty, I don't want to say sophisticated necessarily, but they have had a good game plan in place for how you're going to beat Xavier, and that's taking away Quincy Olivari's 3-point looks, funneling the drives, everything into the mid-range to force Desmond, Claude, and Davion McKnight to shoot a lot of tough mid-range shots for the most part. That's what you're kind of looking for defensively against Xavier for the most part, it seems like this year. And in both cases, like DePaul didn't really just seem to have any plan in place for how they were going to keep Quincy Olivari from getting a lot of space coming off these screening actions that Xavier was running him off of after the first game. It was basically the same story in the second game. In fact, it seemed like he was even more open and they cared even less. And against Georgetown, same thing goes for Desmond Claude. It's like he's killing them off the dribble. And it's weird because Ed Cooley is, I mean, in my opinion, a pretty good coach, but it didn't really seem like they had any adjustment to make. And maybe it's just that their players aren't capable of listening to the game plan and recognizing the game plan that coaches are trying to put in place. But they just weren't able to really cut Des off and get that extra help to force those tough mid-range shots that he typically has. Now, credit to Des too, because he didn't settle for any shots in this game. He just kept, it was like second, third efforts on the drive. Sometimes when he'd get cut off, he'd pivot back the other way or he'd spin back the other way, and he'd put his head down and try a little bit harder. And I thought he deserved a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. Rick, anything else there from those 2 performances before we move on just a little bit to our next topics?
No, not at all. But I think I think Dez has been a big topic of conversation though this year in general, Paul. And it's tough because in the current fan climate, it's like everything has to be the guy is the greatest or he needs to be gone from our team and he can't play at all. And
there's no middle ground.
Right. And with Desmond Claude, like his whole season has lived somewhere in the nuance in the middle ground. It's like he is a good player. Every Big East team would love to have him. He should be a Big East starting level player. At the same time, he needs to be a lot more efficient on the offensive end. He has had some really rough games where he has kind of taken Xavier's offense out of contention in a half of a game where he's just missed a bunch of mid-range shots and maybe even gotten tunnel vision at times to where he's not moving the ball as well as he should have. And I would also say he probably hasn't developed into the star the way it developed into being a star player in the Big East, the way maybe the coaching staff or other media members before the season thought he was going to this year. Now, I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I don't think he has enough help. I think Jerome Hunter and Zach Fremantle make him look a lot better if they're still in there playing with him, and he has some more experienced guys who know the system that can take some pressure off and can do some damage in the front court. But it's fair to say, like, there is nuance here. Everything hasn't been perfect for him. But at the same time, this huge performance here late in the year is a great reminder of Desmond Claude is a really talented player, and he is not the issue for Xavier this year.
Yeah, I could not have said that any better because he's caught a lot of flack, but for what he has caught, it's mostly been because of the expectations that were put on him going into the year. I think for any sophomore, this would be an outstanding season, but because of what so many people expect, and to be fair, a lot of that was probably, on what we have talked about and what a lot of people have talked about going into the season and what we saw in the preseason. Rick, I don't want to throw you under the bus, but at least for myself and what I talked about, I mean, I know for sure I spent a lot of time talking about Des Claude coming into the year, and to put those expectations on somebody, just as a lot of people had put on, somebody like Lazar Djokovic or some of these other guys that you constantly hype up going into a season. I think you and I, where a lot of people had put a lot of expectations on Lazar, you and I put our preseason expectations on Des, and I don't think he's necessarily not lived up to the expectations. I think it's just a lot of people maybe took what we said and assumed that was going to transition into a Colby Jones junior year type of performance, which isn't necessarily what we've seen this year, but it's not like he's having a bad year.
Yeah. In fact, I think it really tracks similarly to Colby's sophomore year, where this was kind of the sentiment around Colby's sophomore year. Now, fans, it seems like every year get more hateful and everything else online with what they say to these players. But in terms of where he's at, I think a lot of players after Colby's sophomore year is like, I don't know if this guy's going to cut it. He's not good enough to be a go-to player. He's not a first option, all those types of things. And a lot of it was fair at that time. And I think you could say the same thing about Des Claude. And I would say he definitely hasn't quite lived up to the expectation that I had for him before the season, where I thought there's a decent chance this is like a first team All Big East type player. If not, he's probably a second team All Big East type player. And as we're sitting here, I don't think he's going to be making any of the All Big East teams this year. I don't think he's one of the top 2 or 3 wings in the Big East at this point, but he is definitely a top half of the Big East type talent at the wing, I think. And I mean, I do think people get lost when they say he hasn't performed well in big games or he hasn't been consistent enough. It's like, well, there have definitely been games where you needed more out of him if Xavier was going to have a chance to win them. But you also, 36 at Georgetown now, 26 versus Butler at Cintas, 23 against St. John's at Cintas, and 21 at St. John's, 22 against Creighton at Cintas, 22 against Providence at Cintas, 21 at Providence, 20 at Creighton. He's had a lot of 20-plus point performances this year in the Big East. That's like more than half the Big East games right there we just named. Or like at least like 8 games I think we just named off right there. So almost half the games they've played to this point. It's I think the narrative about Des Claude has gone way overboard in one direction, and now I know a lot of people are really defending him after this big performance he had against Georgetown. And I think obviously the real answer, the real assessment of his sophomore season is somewhere there in between. He's had some really great moments and a lot of up and down moments throughout the year. And I think the biggest thing for as a Xavier fan that I'd be looking at is hopefully he can come back and continue to grow, because that is what this team is missing more than anything, is experience within the system, guys who really care and have been through the wars, and it means something. I look at last year's Sweet 16 run. What made that group so special? It wasn't their overwhelming talent. It was because they were a group that had tried for multiple years and had come up short and had continued to get better together. And then obviously they got the coaching from Sean Miller that helped put them over the top. But I think the guys continuing to grow together is a huge part of this. And it's something that a lot of teams are missing now in the transfer portal era.
Yeah, for sure. I think the transfer portal era has jaded so many people to the point where if somebody doesn't have a good year, you assume they're going to leave. Or if they have a great year at a not so huge school, you assume they're going to go to a bigger school afterwards. But then you have to look at what this coaching staff has done with so many players over the years. And I know specifically with Sean and in these last couple of years of him being here, the track record of success of development, it leads you to believe that you have a pretty good chance of retaining the guys that you want to retain and saying, hey, especially in the backcourt, look at what we've done for X, Y, and Z and where you can get just because you're here with us and what we can provide for you. So it's a lot about buy-in. It's a lot about the player's attitude. It's a lot about what that player has to give. And if they buy in and they're willing to compete at that level, yeah.
Kind of a funny note there, what you're talking about with the fans who are jaded by players transferring, or they feel like a player plays well, he may transfer and they may lose him. I do find it funny that constantly throughout the course of this year, all I've heard is, this guy needs to leave. We need to get this guy out of our program. We need this guy to transfer. It's like fans say they hate the transfer portal, but they are the quickest to talk about using the transfer portal to better their team and get rid of guys, and they want constant change. And so, I mean, I constantly hear about how the transfer portal is going to ruin the sport with fans. I don't know if that's true. If you look at the professional ranks, I think fans love free agency. It's hugely popular. And I think it's going to be very similar at the collegiate ranks, because as we hear all season long, fans are already talking about who's going to be leaving their team in the spring.
Yep. All right, let's move on to Kachi Nzeh. How is he held up in the first real action of the season? We've seen him a couple of times, only twice before the last 3 weeks. Did he play more than 3 minutes in a game? He played 10 minutes against Purdue. He played 9 minutes at UConn. But other than that, he hadn't played more than 3 minutes in a game. And now since Seton Hall, he played 20 minutes against Seton Hall, only 1 minute against Providence, but then 15, 22, and 28 against Marquette, DePaul, and Georgetown. He's gotten some real run. He had his career high, his season high, career high, 13 points. He was a perfect 5 for 5 from the field against Georgetown. He was 3 for 4 from the free throw line. Had a couple of steals. He played 28 minutes, 6 boards. I like what I've seen from Kachi Nzeh so far. It's promising.
I really like what I've seen from Kachi Nzeh, and I say that understanding he has shown at times that he is raw, and he has shown that he maybe isn't always in the right spot, and he is messing up on the defensive end at times. So I understand all of that. There are real reasons he hasn't been playing a lot of minutes this year, and he hasn't helped this team more sooner when they needed it. At the same time, I do think there is a lot to like, Paul, and the biggest thing is it's kind of refreshing to see after a season in which Xavier's front court has been bullied a lot and they haven't had the physicality and they've struggled on the glass. It has been nice to see a guy who has seemingly his strength on the court right now is that physical toughness and the ability to sort of jump through guys and rebound and rip the ball away from opponents who are big, tough guys. Xavier just hasn't been able to do a lot of that this year with their front court. And it feels like Kachi has brought some of that here in the last 4 or 5 games where he's gotten to play significant minutes.
So where do you see as far as the future goes? I'm not asking you to pull out a crystal ball here, but if you're thinking about comparisons and what Kachi Nzeh could be, I think you try to project that raw talent, and sometimes it's hard to do. But what do you see out of a guy like Kachi?
I think he has a future in the Big East. Now, where this goes in terms of is he going to be a big-time starter and average a double-double or something at some point in his career? I have no idea about that. But I would say, in terms of what really matters to Xavier fans right now and what they're most interested in, I think Kachi Nzeh, if you're asking me, who are you most certain will be back next year for Xavier out of the front court players? I think I would lean toward Kachi has the best chance of being back with next year's team. Now I say that there'll be multiple guys that'll likely be back out of the front court players. But if I'm trying to say who I'm most confident in, I think Kachi would, because it seems like they've been most certain of his development long term. Like they had a plan in place for him. They knew this was going to be mostly a development year for him. And now you're starting to see some of the fruits of that development already right here at the end of the season as he's making his way onto the court. I would even say, Paul, if you go back to, I realize those games in the Bahamas were less than meaningless in terms of the level of competition they were playing. But you look at that, you look at like the blue-white scrimmages and stuff, it's almost surprising based on what Xavier struggled with this year that Kachi didn't get more minutes earlier in the year and find his way into the rotation, because we saw some of these same things that he's doing now before the season started with his toughness, his athleticism, his defense, his rebounding. I guess my only answer to that is probably like, I just don't think seeing him at practice and now even seeing him in more extended minutes that he has had a firm grasp on the system and where he's supposed to be on offense and on defense within the ball screen coverages. And it's tough to trust a guy when you're in the heat of the battle and you've already got a front court that you're not sure of. Like, what am I going to get from this guy on any given night? What am I going to get from that guy? To put out a freshman who may not even be in the right spot for 3 or 4 minutes of a game where you know it's going to come down to the last possessions, that's probably tough for a coaching staff. So I guess that's probably where I'd come out on why he didn't see more minutes sooner. Yep.
Anything else on Kachi?
I don't think so, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts. What do you think about his future for like next year? Do you assume he will be back?
It's hard for me to assume that any of these guys are going to be back.
But
as just because when you look at one way, and that's not to say, it's tough for me to get a read on anybody with the way that it goes now, when you think of the opportunities that maybe a guy like Kachi could have at a mid-major type school because he spent a year at Xavier. But if you are Kachi and this coaching staff took a chance on you and they prioritized you as a recruit, you weren't highly recruited. Sean Miller specifically goes out with David Miller, finds you, recruits you, brings you to Xavier, and is patient enough to work with you. And then the other thing, too, that I will point out from this is that, and we're going to get to this more in a second with Sean Miller's radio comments, but when a coach makes a comment about you or talks about not playing guys or talks about playing guys more, it doesn't always pan out, right? It's like the old Mick Cronin, nobody's going to be playing, and then, it's the same starting lineup in the next game, right?
Yeah, we're doing open tryouts for new players.
Yeah, we're doing
anyone on campus.
Yeah, exactly. But when a coach makes a statement like Sean did about Kachi, that he's worked his way into the rotation, and then backs it up by playing him rotational minutes, and Kachi performs well in those minutes, that gives me the confidence to say that Kachi has seen what he could be here over these last 4 or 5 games and is willing to take a chance on that to come back and see what he could be over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, you almost wonder if that's part of what this is here at the end of the year, of like the coaching staff making sure they're dangling that carrot for him, that it's not all just talk. Like, hey, we really do think you've made strides and you really have gotten better and you really are in our future plans. So here's the minutes we're going to show you at the end of the year here, because we want to make sure you feel good about coming back. I could very much see that being in the thought process about how you're approaching this. And I'll just add one other thing onto this conversation as we're talking about how like the art of putting together a roster or keeping a roster together at the end of a season goes. I'm not saying this specifically for Kachi, but I'm just saying you're mentioning Xavier bringing him back, having a plan for him, developing all this stuff. Well, you now also have to think about your resource allocation when it comes to NIL, right? And maybe Xavier's thinking a sophomore returning who didn't really produce anything as a freshman is slotted into this level as NIL. And maybe there's a school out there who's had their eyes on Kachi and they say, look, see, he's what we thought he was. And again, I don't think this is specific to Kachi. I'm just throwing out a scenario that could play out for any player at any time on anyone's roster. A team sees like, man, look what he's done at the end of the year. We knew he was good. Let's offer him above market value for NIL and see if we can lure that guy away. That all of a sudden, because you're saying you can't really assume anything with anyone, that's why you can't. Because there's a new part of this game when it comes to putting your roster together and keeping your roster together that you may not always think about. And it could play out something like that. So that's why we're always going to be hesitant to say, yeah, this guy will definitely be back next year.
Yep, exactly. All right. Let's get to Sean Miller's comments from the radio show last week. I have 3 quotes that I tweeted that I think are the most important ones that I picked out. Sean said this after the loss to Marquette in Milwaukee. He said, quote, "The disposition of our group in Milwaukee playing Marquette is just fundamentally unacceptable. They were not ready to play. They did not play with great effort. And there's a couple of guys that quite frankly don't deserve to play anymore." He went on to say, talking about next year's team, that, quote, "A lot of the players that I think will be on next year's team, we don't have yet." And then continued in the show saying, "What is expected is that you're going to play your heart out. You're going to play with tremendous effort level from the start of the game to the finish, or else I'm telling you right now, you will never play here. You won't even know who these guys are." I don't know if you can possibly have a stronger statement than that as a coach, because it's different than what Rick Pitino said. Rick Pitino had just lost the game. He got up on the press conference 10 minutes after that game was over, ripped his guys, came back, apologized, whatever. And I'm not saying anything about these comments. I was fired up reading these comments. I love these. And this is part of the reason why you love Sean Miller as a head coach. But Sean went back, took the flight home from Milwaukee, took the day, watched the film, and then went on the radio show and made these comments. So he had thought this through. He knew what he was going to say and challenged his team, and they responded with a 2-0 week. I know it was DePaul and Georgetown, but they easily – I know it was DePaul and Georgetown, Rick, but there was a large segment of this fan base, and if anybody didn't have a little doubt in your mind that, yeah, you're not going to lose to DePaul at home. Because, again, this DePaul team is different from every other DePaul team that you're thinking of and how bad they are. But that Georgetown game, with the way that Xavier had laid down against Marquette and had gotten beaten by Providence at home, beaten by Creighton, you're on a 4-game losing streak. You're thinking, okay, you beat DePaul, but then are you really going to go on the road and win a game? Can this team win a road game? And then Sean Miller comes out, makes those statements. They responded, and they win a couple games.
Yeah, I guess to me, that's the question. It's like, did the team respond, or did they get lucky to pull off a win at Georgetown? And obviously they're going to beat DePaul the way they did. And I don't know if there's a great answer to that. The one thing I will say, he made the comments at a smart time, because it's going to look good when you have those 2 games coming up right after you make comments like that. Your team is going to look like it's playing better. So in that regard, I think it was smart to say it when he did. The other thing I would say is, and this probably goes back to our Desmond Claude conversation, because I know people were going through that tip-off video when he mentioned that there were 2 guys who didn't even move in the tip-off at the Providence game, and so they shouldn't be playing going forward. And everyone went through the video, and let's face it, if you're looking at who is most obviously not moving when that ball was tipped, Desmond Claude still has his hands on his knees at that point. So it felt pretty obvious, even though Sean didn't say any names, that he was at least pointing at Desmond Claude somewhat with that comment. And I also, if you look at the way Desmond played in that Providence game, it was one of his worst performances of the season, probably. He really was not good in that game. So if
Marquette.
Excuse me. I keep saying Providence, Marquette.
It's right.
If for no other reason, I think that individually, Desmond Claude responded to these comments. I think he's played a couple of his best games, and not necessarily just from a scoring standpoint, because I know he did that against Georgetown and not necessarily against DePaul, but just in terms of the effort, the attention to detail on defense, adhering to a game plan, those types of things. I thought Desmond Claude got the message. In terms of the rest of the team, like, did they need the message? Was the message received? I don't know. I didn't think they played all that well against Georgetown, to be quite honest. I thought Desmond Claude was unbelievable in the second half and brought them back with an incredible individual performance. Otherwise, they were very likely to lose to one of the worst high major teams that is out there right now, aside from DePaul. And so I think we will get a better idea of where this team is at this coming week when they play a couple of much tougher games at Butler and then at home against Marquette.
Again, I go back to what I said earlier, where there's a very easy world where this team lays down. They've been eliminated from the NCAA tournament conversation. They don't really have a lot to play for. The transfer portal's a couple of weeks away. You mail it in. You say, all right, we'll finish off a couple of games. We'll take the trip to New York. Maybe we win that Wednesday game. You get waxed by UConn on Thursday afternoon, and the season's over, and you move on. But if you go to Butler You're coming off a 2-0 week, and winning always cures all, right? Winning games always makes everything better. You can listen to the players, you can listen to the coaching staff, you can listen to people around the team. They can say whatever they want. Guys can be as negative as they want to be or as positive as they want to be. But at the end of the day, whether you're beating the 362nd ranked team in the country or whoever it is, having more points than the other team at the end of the day is always going to cure your spirits. And they've done that twice now in the last week. And for 18 to 22-year-olds that are competing at this level that haven't gotten a ton of wins this year, I thought one thing that Sean said, and he has said this multiple times, and he said it again after the Georgetown game, that going 9-9 in conference, he talked about how proud he was of these guys and everything that they've overcome, and the fact that to this point, they've still been able to notch 9 wins in conference play, and that's not nothing. And now you've set yourself up where you win a game this week. I mean, this Butler game, for at least the nostalgia of everything, right? It's a game that Butler cares a lot about. It's a game that if you beat Butler, you keep the 500 under 500 if you beat Butler. So there's a lot of things at play here for this Butler game that you win a couple of games, especially after what Sean said on the radio. At least you have something there.
Yeah, I mean, I really do feel like for both of these two fan bases, if you're playing in a situation where you don't have at large hopes to root for, Xavier versus Butler is about the best thing going for these two fan bases, because they like to get at each other. It'll be meaningful for Butler if they're able to screw up Xavier, whatever Xavier's seeding chances are at the Big East tournament. So they'll feel like that's their Super Bowl game. And like you said, I mean, I think to continue the feel good momentum here coming off these two wins over the dregs of the conference, if you win at Butler and let's say like Kachi Nzeh continues to get more minutes and plays well in that game, I mean, now you're really sort of building on a little something that you have to feel good about, regardless of what it means in terms of where they go in Big East seeding and if they actually could pull off a miracle and make a run to the NCAA tournament or something like that. It would just be good to finish the season on a real positive note and not just say, well, yeah, we had those 2 wins against Georgetown and DePaul.
Yep. All right. Next up here, we're going to talk, Rick, I'll open the floor up for you. Again, I'll say the same thing just to kind of set the stage here. I'll say the same thing I've said for 2 weeks. As far as Sean's future goes at Xavier, I don't know anything. I know as much as you know and what I hear. And you can say that, you don't believe me because I host the Sean Miller podcast. And Paul, you've got to know something and you're just blowing smoke. Believe what you want to believe, but I can tell you right here, I don't know one way or the other anything more than what, Rick, you've reported, or what, the guys on the field of 68 reported this morning. Jeff Goodman talking about Dusty May potentially being a leading candidate at Ohio State. So as far as that goes, I just want to make that clear that, I'm just going based off of those things. But Rick, what have you heard on that end?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to note here is we're starting to get some of the reports coming out, like Jeff Goodman said today, and I think it's important to make clear what he said. He did not really source a report saying that Dusty May is a leading candidate. He said he thinks Dusty May will end up being the leading candidate, or Dusty May will end up getting the job, something but he did parse it with saying basically he thinks this will end up being what's happened. He didn't really source anybody saying this is what's going on. So it's not exactly a report. It's more of this is sort of the tea leaves I'm reading. And I think that makes sense. I think what a lot of national people are seeing right now, and even people behind the scenes in the college basketball world are seeing, is that Indiana doesn't sound like it's likely to open. I mean, they're not going to fire Mike Woodson right now.
Crazy.
And
I know Woodson's an IU guy, but woof.
Yeah, if he doesn't walk away on his own, which some think may be possible just because he has plenty of money and he's been there for a while. But if he doesn't walk away from his own, the sentiment is that he's not going to get fired. At least that's what a lot of the reports have been over the last 2 or 3 weeks. So if that's the case, I think a lot of people are seeing Dusty May down there at Florida Atlantic, knowing he can't wait another year or 2 to get out of Florida Atlantic. That's just not a sustainable place to be. He's got to take a high major job and cash in now. And if that's the case, then he probably becomes the most gettable and the easiest name to sell. Like, to fans who are going to have their different opinions on a guy like McDermott or a guy like Miller who already have a track record. And there are things definitely to like, and there are some things maybe that you don't like about it. Dusty May is the new shiny object that everyone has declared as the next great coach. So, there's nothing about his career to this point to point to and be like, well, there's that we don't like. It's just nothing but upside at this point with what he's done at Florida Atlantic. So he may be the easiest name to sell. I know there are some people behind the scenes who like him. There's the reports about LeBron supporting him. I don't know what the hell that really has to do with anything. I don't think that's very meaningful. What I would tell Xavier fans is this. Right now, as you're hearing these reports, it's really important to keep in mind that no one knows what's going on because Ohio State is just getting going with this search. You pretty much have to wait until all these teams' seasons have ended, unless you were making a hire that was completely out of left field and it was like an NBA assistant coach with no previous experience, or they were going to hire like Chris Mack and someone who was sitting out right now that wasn't a current head coach. Then you are going to have to wait for the season to end before you can really start making moves on this thing. And so what that leads is to a ton of speculation by media members and the Trilly Donovans of the world and all that. But if you've noticed, their information has been a bit all over the place in terms of like who is actually the leading candidate or what is being said. The thing that we've heard from everybody, and I can tell you this is pretty unanimous right now with agents, with other coaches, even with an athletic director or two that I've gotten word from. The thought is that Dusty May, Greg McDermott, or Sean Miller are very likely to end up with this job. Those are the three leading candidates, and it changes day to day who a given source thinks is going to be the lead guy. And there are various reasons they think that. I don't think we're done talking about this with Sean Miller. I think he is very much still potentially a candidate for this job. But I also think it's, especially with the way things are leaning with Indiana, I think that's the most notable piece of information we have right now. That's an update to give you is Indiana not firing Mike Woodson would be very big for Xavier, in my opinion, and their chances of keeping Sean Miller. Because I think if Indiana's open, Dusty May to Indiana is almost a certainty. If Indiana is not open, then Dusty May becomes the lead candidate for a lot of jobs. Could be Louisville, could be Ohio State, but that would definitely likely knock Sean Miller down a peg in terms of some of these coaching searches. So I think that would be the most notable piece of information to give you in terms of an update.
All right. That's basically
pretty much it. Yeah, I did want to get your opinion, Paul. You guys just released the new episode of the Sean Miller podcast today, I think this morning. And it is with a guy that fans love. He is a legend in Xavier basketball history, but this is a guy that I don't think we hear from at all. Like, I don't think Justin Doleman has done hardly any interviews since he graduated from Xavier. There's been a thing or two out there that's written that has been pretty bland, but in terms of like actually getting good insights from him about his playing days and like the man who Justin Doleman is now and all that, I don't think there's a lot out there. I have not listened to this yet. So how did it go? Give us a little tease here.
It was fantastic. In fact, when we finished, Sean got, when we were done recording, Sean turned to us and said he thought that was one of the best ones we've done. And I would have to agree. I mean, it was great. Justin went through everything from his playing career over in Europe. And Sean has told us this story before, but for fans to be able to hear it was the story of Justin and Romain Sato playing together on the same team and how revered those guys, especially Romain, is over in Europe and in the league that they play in and the team they played for. And Sean took one of his teams at Arizona over there and was looking up at the wall and the murals and everything. And there's Romain Sato and there's Justin Doleman, and those guys being able to play together, continue their career at points and play as well as they did. I mean, for Justin to have the career that he did, it wasn't like he just went over there and played for a nobody team and made some money. I mean, he played it for a very good team and was a standout player on that team for over a decade.
Did you guys talk about his flirtation with the NBA at all? Did you get into that?
No.
Because there were always rumors out there that he had the opportunity to come play for an NBA team, but he was such a star and had such a good life over there that he wasn't going to come sit on someone's bench or take the risk of coming. But I've never heard like if that's true or not.
I have a feeling with how good Justin was on the show, we'll have him on again at some point. Because Adam mentioned this on the Twitter Spaces after the Georgetown game. I think if Justin ever wanted to have a career in broadcasting or anything like that, he would probably have a future behind a microphone because he was good. He was very well spoken. He was, direct and to the point. He made the stories that he told both. I mean, culturally, the story of eating the squid ink or something. They try to convince me was a good delicacy. Adam wants to have me try it on the air. I mean, yeah, Paul has pointed out that Adam seems to think they can get me to try this on a show live. There's a few things that I've been suckered into having to do live on a show sometime.
You were a picky eater as a child. I can tell.
No,
you were a picky eater.
No, I'm not. Well, I'm not like picky. It's just I have my favorites and I stick with them.
That's not literally the definition of being a picky eater.
Yeah, but if somebody makes something new, like if my mom's gonna make me something new, and she's cooking dinner, it's like I'll eat it. I'm not gonna say no. But
you're
ordering squid. Yeah, there you go. But I'm not gonna go out to a restaurant and order squid ink. Who does that?
I think everyone saw on your face when that was brought up, and we've seen the outtakes obviously on social media, and everyone saw on your face when that was brought up that you were out completely on overseas.
I guess I have to be in on it.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So Justin and they talked about, as far as Xavier time goes, they talked a lot about the Ohio State game and how that game finished, and also from a coaching perspective, Sean's philosophy in fouling versus not fouling up 3, which is something that everybody always talks about, and they spent a couple of minutes talking about that. So yeah, highly recommend. It was a great show. We recorded it right after the DePaul game last week. So shout out to Justin and his family for sticking that one out. We were recording until it was like 10:45 by the time we finished, and he has season tickets, so he's made it down to a few games this year. Yeah, it was good to see him. Good that he's around, and yeah, good show. Hopefully everybody enjoyed it.
All right, good deal. Let's wrap it up with this, Paul, and I'll tell people this before we talk about the Big East tournament scenarios. If you have any questions for us, you want us to answer something random that we didn't hit on already, you can go ahead and pile those in, whether you're on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. We can see it all. Give us your questions here at the end. We'll answer them briefly. If you don't have anything, that's fine too. But Paul, the last thing I want to get to with you is you sent out a tweet earlier today. This is your time to shine. Your time of the year. You love going through all the tournament scenarios and be like, if this team wins this game and that team loses that game, then what does that mean? You played it out. You tweeted out a couple scenarios that could happen for Xavier. It seems to me it's most likely that they end up in the 8-9 game playing Butler, but there's a chance they could have a much better road than that, right?
That's right, Rick. You see, when you get to this time of the year and you get in the first week of March, nobody gets in the lab harder than I do. I was texting Shelby Dermer earlier today, and we were talking about some different scenarios, and I sent him the link for that website that I created a thread for on Musketeer Report. And I said, look, you could talk me into Matt Brady here getting to the final if you just click a few buttons and it goes a certain way, right? I mean, the bracket can always break a certain way on bball.notnothing.net. But anyway, as far as Xavier goes, Rick's bringing it up right here on the screen. There's definitely a path. If you click to the next screen, Rick, if you click to the second, I don't know if you can do that on the next picture. This picture right here is I would say a pretty likely scenario. I wouldn't say it's the most likely, but Xavier and Butler playing in the 8-9 game at 4:00 on Wednesday. Butler is locked into that game. Now, whether they're wearing the white jerseys or not as the 8 seed or the 9 seed, that's TBD. But Butler will play in the 8-9 game at 4:00 on Wednesday. Who they play in that game is still TBD. And it's much more likely as we sit here today on Monday afternoon that Xavier avoids that game than it was a couple of days ago. It's going to take some help, but if Xavier beats Butler, it really just all rides on Xavier beating Butler at Hinkle on Wednesday night, which is going to be a tall task. I mean, we all know how much Butler cares about that game, not to say that Xavier doesn't, but we know for sure how much Butler and their fans care about winning that game at Hinkle against Xavier. So for Xavier to win that game, that would set the table. That would really open up Pandora's box of all the scenarios that could play out over the last couple of days and the last day on Saturday of the regular season. Butler is the only team that doesn't play on Saturday. They're the ones that have the bye going into the Big East tournament. But if you look at what Xavier could do if they beat Butler, I mean, if Seton Hall was to upset Villanova at the Pavilion, which I don't think is completely out of the question, If Seton Hall was to win that game, then they would have DePaul on Saturday in their final game of the season. Xavier now has to play Butler at Butler, but you also play Tyler Kolek will not play for Marquette on Saturday. He's sitting out the final 2 games of the regular season. Marquette doesn't have a ton to play for. They could play for NCAA tournament seeding. Marquette could slip as low as 4 in the conference. They could, if they go 0-2 and some things don't break their way, if they go 0-2 and Seton Hall goes 2-0, Seton Hall would actually leapfrog up into that 3rd seed and Marquette would drop down to the 4-5 game. So Marquette, it's not like they don't have anything to play for, but they certainly have a whole lot less to play for than Xavier does in a sense of just how that Saturday game would match up. So they've already said that Tyler Kolek's not going to play on Saturday, which means if you're sitting here and you're thinking to yourself as a Xavier fan, what could happen throughout the week? If you beat Butler on Wednesday night, you get a little bit of help. It's not out of the question that Xavier ends up as a 6th seed, and it's not totally out of the question that Xavier ends up as playing Seton Hall on Thursday night, a team they've already beaten by 20 this season. Now, they did get blasted by them a few weeks ago, but it's not totally out of the question. I think just from the way it's stacking up. And I got a question on Twitter a few minutes ago. It said, Paul, which path would you prefer? Tough exercise of wanting an easier path to an auto bid versus higher quality wins. Look, I think Xavier is totally out of the at-large conversation right now, because if you think about it, Xavier, if they go 2-0 this week, they would have 2 quad 1 wins added to their resume. So you'd end up with 4 right now. They have 4, right? They're at 4 right. They're at 2 right now. I think they have 2. They might have 3. But then you would add potentially 2 next week, which means that you would have 19 win Xavier team. So Xavier has 3 quad 1 wins right now. That would put you at 5 at the end of this week. I still don't think that a team with a quad 4 loss, because Delaware, who got killed over the weekend, they've dropped down into quad 4. So that Delaware loss becomes a quad 4 loss for the Musketeers. I just don't think that Xavier gets themselves this late in the game back into the at-large conversation. I just don't think it happens. If they win out and they win 2 games in the Big East tournament, that'll sit 19-15, get them into Dayton with the strength of schedule. I don't think so. I just don't think 19-15 gets you in, because like we've talked about so many times, the conference tournaments don't matter nearly as much as people think they do. And if Xavier is this far out of the conversation with just 2 games remaining, and a Butler team that, mind you, if they lose that game to Xavier, I don't want to say they will drop out of being a quad 1 game, but they might be like right on the cusp. Actually, no, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. They would not. They would not. I don't think they would. But either way, Rick, I know I'm talking a lot here about a lot of things that could or couldn't happen. But
we have that scenario up right now where if Xavier were to get the 6th seed, and they would potentially play Seton Hall as the 3 seed. That is by far, I know some people have asked, like, what is the best route for Xavier to get? This is by far the best scenario they could possibly have. If they have DePaul on Wednesday night, then you play Seton Hall on Thursday night in the quarterfinals. Those are 2 very winnable games for this team. And then you look at the semifinals on Friday night, and the other side of that bracket is Villanova versus Georgetown, and the winner of that game, which is likely to be Villanova, would be playing against Creighton. So you have the winner of Villanova-Creighton. We would expect that to be Creighton. If by somehow, some miracle, you get Villanova in that game, now you really feel like you have a chance to make it to the championship, and you'll take whatever happens there. But if you get Villanova, if you get Creighton, obviously it's going to be very difficult, and you're probably screwed either way. You're definitely screwed if you get UConn in the championship game, but you take your chances if you can make it that far, right? So, I think this is, if you're looking for what scenario do you want as a Xavier fan, this is clearly the scenario. You want Xavier as the 6th seed, and you want to play Seton Hall in that 3 seed game.
Yep. All right. So, and again, that basically all just rides on Xavier beating Butler on Wednesday night. And I saw Troy pointed out in the chat talking about the streak. I was talking about the streak of the regular season and having a losing season in the regular season. Xavier has the 6th longest streak of not having a losing regular season. Last time that happened was 95-96. Kansas, Arizona, Michigan State, Gonzaga, and Duke. Shout out Retire 52. Those are the only other schools ahead of Xavier as far as not having a losing season goes. So, you win 2 more games, you avoid that, and then you go from there. But Rick, that's all I have.
That's it.
7 o'clock on Wednesday night at Hinkle. I'll be there. We'll see how it goes. Transfer portal opens on March 18th, and Big East tournament a week away. We'll probably do a podcast on Monday before the Big East tournament a week from today, but that's all I got.
That's all I got. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Rick.